IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. Fascism is a much heard word nowadays in the global context and also in India, where many political commentators are saying present conditions in the country are fascist. Fascism per se refers to a particular ideology witnessed in Italy under Mussolini in the 1930s, but now has come to be used for any far-right authoritarian government which propagates ultranationalism and centralized power while suppressing all forms of dissent. Professor Jason Stanley, who teaches philosophy at Yale, has examined this in great detail in his book, in his relatively new book. It came out, I think, a year or two ago, How Fascism Works. This follows another book of his called How Propaganda Works. He has given the examples of the US and other countries around the world and traced some commonalities which will be familiar to all Indians. Culture wars, harking back to a so-called golden period in the nation's history, and constant evocation of threats to the majority community. Professor Stanley joins us today to further discuss these and other themes. And I think what we are going to do is to ask him to connect this with Indian conditions, but without losing the global perspective. Jason Stanley, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you so much. I'm an extraordinary admirer of what the Wire does.
Thank you. You mentioned that you are the son of two Holocaust survivors. Your grandmother wrote a book about the early years of Hitler in Germany and his Nazi party, which he saw. Did that inspire you to write your own book?
My past certainly plays a role because I was raised by parents who noticed similarities between what they grew up with and my home country of the United States. So my mother, so the ways in which a minority is scapegoated, is used as a scapegoat, that's something that my parents grew up hearing. They grew up hearing the government attack them. They grew up hearing dominant group members think of them as a kind of internal enemy. So I grew up with a kind of structure in my head. I was always aware, due to my mother's working in the criminal justice system as a court stenographer, that in the United States, Black Americans were going to be a target. So it's a structure that I grew up with. When you grow up with my background, you know that it's possible. It's not some fantasy. You know that it could happen anywhere. If it happened in Germany, which was the leading culture, had the greatest universities in the world, it was Germany of the 1920s and 30s. It can happen anywhere.
What you mentioned, your background, I think you're referring to the fact that you're Jewish. Am I right?
Yes. My background, I'm Jewish, and my parents were born in Europe and were refugees.
But should we be using words like fascist, for every situation when we see an authoritarian government, especially when it curbs dissent? Or is this an exaggeration in some cases, given that some democratic traditions and institutions still remain strong? The press, and I'm talking here about India, but definitely the United States, more so in the United States, the press remains largely free, people can express their views, and elections are held regularly. So should we be calling it fascism?
Okay, several points and distinctions to make. First, there are authoritarian governments that suppress dissent that aren't fascist at all. For instance, Stalin wasn't a fascist. Fidel Castro was not a fascist. There are communist governments. Obviously, there are communist governments that are fully democratic. Kerala as an example, but there are hardline authoritarian governments that are not fascist at all. Authoritarianism comes in different forms. Fascism is a kind of authoritarianism that is based on a group, ethnic, or religious identity, and takes the internal enemy to be a minority, a religious or ethnic or racial minority. So it's a very specific form. A communist authoritarianism just looks very different. Communist authoritarianism is geared towards the future. It says in the future we will have a utopia. We're going to change society now so that in the future we will achieve something that have never achieved before. Fascism looks to the past. Fascism says in the past we were great. We were pure. In the past we didn't have this internal enemy. So they're very different structures. So that's the first point. The second point is we need to distinguish a fascist regime from a fascist social and political movement, a fascist political party. The United States, it does not have a fascist regime by any means. What we do have is a fascist social and political movement that is seeking to take power. India, so it's a continuum. Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, these were fascist regimes. It was at the end scale of the it was at the end of the scale. You're always going to have, most countries have fascist social and political movements and always will. The goal is to keep those fascist social and political movements from taking power and changing the law so that fascism enters a legal phase. We have to remember that everything the Nazis did was legal because it was a fascist regime. So my book, How Fascism Works, is about social and political, about fascist politics, about how a fascist party or a fascist social and political movement operates to seize power, the kind of myths they use, the myth of a mythic past, the conspiracy theories, like the Hindu love jihad is a Muslim. The Hindu love jihad is an example I use. So there's particular tactics that are fascist, and what fascism is a constant threat for almost or maybe any country, and it's a one particular version of authoritarianism. Very few countries right now have fascist regimes. Maybe Russia might be an example.
So that was actually quite a nuanced way of looking at it, though, Donald Trump did look towards a mythic past and said, make America great again. But we will not nitpick here for the time being. Your book...
Yes, Donald Trump used fascist political tactics constantly.
I must confess, by the way, that while you're talking about this, while I was reading the book, some of the key kind of boxes, I was trying to tick them vis-a-vis my country. And some things work, some things don't. Being a journalist, obviously the media is uppermost in my mind. But on the other hand, there's a lot of independent media reporters go around doing very, very good stories. They challenge the government. So, but at the same time, there is a harking back to a golden past when colonialism, though they don't mention colonialism for obvious reasons, for some reason the British get away with, free pass, but the Mughals, and before that, several Muslim rulers, they are named. So 1,200 years of slavery, etc., etc. And all of that harking back to the golden past of Hindus is linked with the Muslims. That it's the Muslims who came here and then ruined this nation. Firstly, again, you can go into 15,000 seminars to ask whether India was ever a nation or a country or something like that. But we'll leave that aside for the time being. So I just want to pick up the United States. Your book talks about Donald Trump as if he's still ruling, or maybe I got an old edition. So it is in some ways already outdated. The ideas remain fresh. But looking back, do you think that in the past year and a half, you've seen the right wing's power reduce? He lost President Netanyahu is facing corruption charges and he lost. President Bolsonaro is facing public opposition. And if elections were held today, I wager that he may not make it. So it's a kind of not outdated, but a work in progress because they've gone, but somebody else may come.
So it's very important to distinguish strong versus weak from fascism versus not fascism. Just because someone is not successful at taking over a country doesn't mean they didn't try. Bolsonaro is a pure example of a fascist demagogue. He's regularly asking the military to take over and place him in charge. The military won't. That doesn't mean he's not a fascist. It means he's not a successful fascist. So let's be clear here. So my book was published in 2018, in September 2018. So that's 3.5 years ago. And it's not really about Trump. It's about fascist social and political movements, characterizing them so you can recognize them in any country. As I said earlier, fascism is permanent. It's something we're always going to face. So we need to be able to recognize it before it enters its legal phase, the phase where it starts to change the laws. Now to your question about the right wing, the Republicans in the United States. In state after state, they've changed the laws. They've changed the laws governing elections. They've changed the laws governing what you can teach in school about history. So fascism in the United States on the state level has entered its legal phase. Many states have passed anti-protest laws, which restrict the right of people to protest. This is, I think, in anticipation of stealing the election in 2024. So Republicans control many state houses, and they are changing the laws to make the kind of coup that Donald Trump tried to do in 2020 legal, essentially. So this is what one has to be aware of, that, fascism in its early phases is violent, illegal, involves, hate speech against minorities, violence against minorities, saying minorities are out to steal your women and ruin the country. So that's how you recognize fascism in its early phases. In its later phases, you change the laws, you change citizenship laws like the Nuremberg. So you really have to pay attention if a country is changing its laws governing citizenship, who is a citizen, who isn't a citizen. That's fascism in its legal phase. So that looks different and it takes time. So in the United States, what we're seeing is a patient, authoritarian, fascist political party changing laws so they can make moves in the future.
As they say, Trump is out, but Trumpism continues.
Absolutely. Trump has been extremely successful. He has in no way disappeared. And there are more dangerous figures than Trump. DeSantis, Governor DeSantis of Florida. What Trump did is he showed what's possible. He showed that it's possible to take extreme authoritarian measures and try to stay in power. And he almost succeeded. So that's a signal to future would-be authoritarians that are even more formidable than Trump.
So again, while you were speaking, I couldn't help think of India and many other countries. So I'm going to actually put that. It's not generic, but it's a pointed question. I feel that the several key factors that you have organized of fascistic movements and governments which project those ideas, and what they have in common is victimhood. This is from your book, as is the fear of being swamped by the minorities, Jews in Germany, Mexicans in the US, Muslims in India. Muslims are 200 million out of 1.4 billion. So you're really looking at about 15%. And the same, I think, applies to the Mexicans. And of course, the constant sense of simmering resentment, even among the well-to-do. So what I call the resentment of the successful, which is something that I have just not been able to fathom, that if you're successful, you've got a very, very good job, you're doing well, your children are doing well, all the things that spell success you have, and yet you are simmering with resentment. I don't know what it is. Perhaps you will be able to enlighten us.
Right. So let me make some distinctions first. So Nazism didn't think Jews were going to take over, were going to outnumber non-Jewish Germans. They rather thought that Jews were the elite leftist liberals, and they were going to open the gates of the country to immigrants who were then going to swamp the Germans. So there's two enemies. There's the elite, there's a group of liberal elites who want to be tolerant, and they're going to lead to the destruction of the country. They're going to, by their tolerance and their demands for tolerance, are really a way to attack the dominant group. So a fascist movement targets two groups. They target a group that are supposedly the elite. Usually they call them the liberals, the Marxists. They say they're introducing homosexuality, feminism, and they're allowing the minority group to take over. So and then they attack the minority group. So that's the structure. I don't know if there's an attack on the elite and universities in India. I think there is, but that's the structure of fascism that we're looking at.
So sorry to interrupt you. So the notion of racial purity enters the picture also.
Absolutely. It doesn't need to be racial. I think that it could be religion. So purity is central to fascism. So the internal enemy is. There's distinction. There's the elites and liberals want to make the country impure, and purity. This idea that the minority group is dirty, is disgusting. That you see a lot in the politics of immigration in the United States, and that this is what the elites and the liberals want. So this is the structure we find. The dominant group, and this is what you use to make the dominant group feel that they're victimized. The idea is that if anyone other than the dominant group is part of the cultural mainstream, then then they're under threat. So you use this idea, exactly right, you use this idea of purity, and you say there's impurity, and you package impurity as like a disease. That's why genocide is preceded by calling the targeted group termite. You always have to really worry when politicians use words like termites, cockroaches.
Has been used. The exact word was used about the so-called millions of refugees coming from Bangladesh. Now, it is true that some refugees must have come in the past, but Bangladesh economically is doing far better than India is at this moment. And their economy is rocking, to put it in a colloquial way. So that so-called influx doesn't apply here anymore, but the exact word was used. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, right. What's happening in India with the CAA and the National Registry put together is an attempt to remove citizenship from tens of millions of Muslim Indians by claiming that they're Bangladeshi they're Bangladeshi undocumented immigrants. So you have something like the Nazi Nuremberg laws already setting in place. And in Assam, there are already detention centers, right? So yeah, so you really have to really be concerned about citizenship laws, because that's, once you start, you can do anything to someone who's stateless. So the stripping citizenship from people is a preparation for genocide. But so yes, right. I hadn't realized how much immigration was a theme in what's happened in the hate speech in India. But yeah, the idea that immigrants are teaming over and making the country impure, this is key to fascist politics. And it works even if there are no immigrants. Like Hungary has no immigrants, but nobody wants to live in Hungary. But yet, and Poland, same thing. But yet they use immigrants as this threat, even though there are no immigrants in those countries. So it's a way to make people think. It's a way to do this purity politics. Oh no, our country is going to be invaded, and so we need a violent response.
So you may have heard of the RSS, which is the fountainhead of Narendra Modi's entire political thought, and which is now in control. And they worked hard for it over the last almost 100 years. He had visited, one of the early leaders, he had visited Italy in 1931 and met Mussolini. And he really, really praised Italy. In the early literature of the RSS, Germany was hailed as a great example to follow, Nazi Germany. And this appears to have inspired him. Certainly some of the tactics of the Hindu supremacists are straight out of the Nazi fascist playbook. Now, obviously, and this is very, very important, it is given an Indian, it's not a direct lift. It has Indian and Hindutva characteristics. So just like Deng Xiaoping said, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, now we are seeing this with Hindu characteristics. I don't want to be flippant about it, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yes. Well, in the case of India, as you say, with Savarkar and Golwalkar, you have explicit people who explicitly talked about used the Nazis as a model and explicitly talked about imitating what the Nazis did with Jews with Muslims. So you have a direct causal influence between Nazism and RSS. So that is extremely concerning. You also have a culture, in which people don't really understand or realize. They don't share the view that's shared in the rest of the world, that Hitler was one of the worst human beings ever. Mein Kampf is often read in India as a book by, a great conqueror. And so this is extremely concerning. So let's put this together. BJP emerges from RSS. The main intellectual leaders of RSS, the originators, were explicit genocidal ultranationalists. And so there's no guessing here in the case of India. It's not like, people are like, well, how could there be a relation between fascism and India? Well, it's just straightforward. And so, and then you have a background culture in which people don't really understand that this project, genocidal project of Hitler, was and Hitlerism were horrific and should be condemned, and in no way should be regarded as any kind of great leadership. So India is extremely concerning.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Do you wonder why China does the things that it does? Or want to know how we could improve online privacy? Or perhaps you're thinking about how we can kickstart India's economy. If you'd like to search for the answers to such questions, check out All Things Policy, a daily public policy podcast that covers everything from employment figures to aircraft carriers. Tune in from Monday to Friday for new episodes and fresh takes.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. So your book doesn't have too much about India, and I'm hoping that you will update it. However, you've written about the Citizenship Amendment Act. According to me, things have become worse in many ways. There has been attacks on minorities. There's a state election going on, and it'll get over in the next couple of weeks. And there, the chief minister and the government have over the last 3 or 4 years been extremely, I won't use the word ruthless, but certainly systemically gone after the minorities in many ways, including taking away their, threatening to take away their property if they protest. Meanwhile, they are being deprived of their citizenship, so they can't protest. So it's lots is happening on that front. And the attacks have been legal and extra-legal. They've come from freelancers who are not attached to the state. They've come from the state. But you wrote an article for The Guardian some time ago in which you mentioned India, and I'm sure there are other pieces also. You may have spoken about it, but have you plans to write a special book about other countries and including India, or update your book?
India, for me, well, let me address a couple points first before I get to my future plans. This is very typical. What you described is very typical of fascism in its sort of mid phase. The Timothy Snyder talks about you have to be concerned when the illegal and legal militias, the sort of legal police forces, join with illegal violent militias, and it's kind of hard to tell them apart. So, like RSS battalions and official government forces, when they sort of mix together and one supports the other, that's a really bad sign. Now to the second question as to my future plans. I mean, I think that what you have now is you have a global fascist movement in multiple countries, taking different forms, taking with different targets. And this is what my work is going to combat and devoted to combating. The case of India worries me perhaps more than any other, because you have such it's such a great democracy, the world's largest democracy, and we're seeing systematic movement towards fascism in its legal phase. As I've said before in this interview, the changing of the citizenship laws to render the targeted population second-class citizens. This is the Nazi 1935 Nuremberg laws. India has a very clever way of doing it by combining the National Registry with CAA so that Hindus without documentation become immediate citizens, but Muslims without documentation are become stateless. And when you're stateless, you can do anything to people who are stateless. So the world's attention needs to be focused on India, and I hope one day soon India will return to being the great secular democracy that its constitution proclaims.
So interesting. You should talk about the world needs to kind of take notice, because in 2019, the week before the elections, I was in the US, in New York. I met a few, for want of a better word, progressives. Of course, I presume that governments have to be very, very sensitive and careful about relations, and they express things very gingerly. India is a huge market, and possibly a strategic partner, nobody wants to spoil the relationship. But I met these, I don't know what words to use anymore, but leftists in the US context, but they were a step further, who said, no. I said the elections have, the results show that Mr. Modi has come back with a huge majority. And either they were not following it, or they didn't want to listen to it, or I don't know what it was, but they said, no. We look at India, and I won't mention the journals, but you can well use your imagination. And it's only now, in the last 2 years, actually, little before the COVID lockdown hit, when CAA happened, and had it not been for the protest, which was a sustained protest, it wouldn't have been put in abeyance. In COVID, as you know, the situation has been quite poorly handled in certain states, in the second wave especially. Now people are, the New York Times, The Guardian, many other publications are reporting And the situation, I don't know how you see it sitting in America, but from what one gathers, it's beginning to look quite this. Of course, there's the opposite side, which is a large Hindutva lobby of people who go full on and go after this. So all this as a precursor to saying that were observers of international relations, I won't say India observers, because they were a little quicker off the mark, observers of international relations felt till very recently that India was a strong democracy and nothing that it would hold fast. And do you think that that is beginning to change?
Absolutely. India's reputation as a democracy is taking a very serious hit. The attacks in the universities, Pratap Mehta having to step down as rector, and then from Ashoka, and then having to losing his job. I mean, there's nobody more moderate and mainstream than Pratap Mehta. So prominent Indian intellectuals being targeted, Rana Ayub being targeted, a very well-known journalist, and then the pogroms, the vicious attacks on Muslims. I mean, it's the 20th anniversary this year of Gujarat. You know, these are things people know. So, people have been slow. People have been slow to put this together. I think the reason people are slow to put it together is because things are happening democratically. So what the system that is enshrined in India's constitution is liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is not majority rule. It's not, it means rights for minorities. Liberalism involves rights for minorities, and it's India is, by its constitution, a secular liberal democracy. People aren't noticing because Modi is using fascist politics to win elections from a majority. So people are like, oh, what's wrong? They're not stealing the elections. I mean, I think they are stealing the elections because the pressure on the press is so severe. So there's so much of the press is essentially beholden to the government that affects things. But the situation in India is a large majority. Too many people in a large majority are behind suppressing the minority. And so it isn't a situation like the United States where you have a party, the Republican Party, that's losing national elections and so has to change election laws. The situation in India is where the majority is voting for leaders of their own ethnic or religious identity. So it's sort of tyranny of the majority, as it were. And that's a little trickier to criticize because then you're saying, well, you have to explain liberalism to people. You say, well, if the majority decides to strip citizenship, to remove citizenship from the minority, that's now no longer a liberal democracy. But since it works since it's majority rule, everyone is saying, what's the problem? If you're not paying attention, you might think, what's the problem with India?
So, in fact, that's the tricky one as far as liberals are concerned. I have my views on the liberals. Again, we need to do another interview for that. But, and they are a big target. Not the liberals per se, because the liberals have not caused any harm, is the idea of the liberals. Mainly, I just need to point out a tiny detail is the rule of the majority in parliament, but not in terms of voting.
Right, of course.
Now that, of course, doesn't mean a thing because a lot of people came out to vote. So, and the opposition is not unified. Sorry.
Right. I just meant,
No,
it's not like elections are being stolen.
No. I know what you meant.
Yeah.
And
parliamentary system, of course,
who has to go along with the tyranny of the majority. I think we need to, if not accept it wholeheartedly, recognize it. I think that's critical. Meanwhile, I would also say that a much of the legacy press, the influential press, the television stations, and that's as far as the media is concerned, the big papers, the small papers, the state level papers, newspapers are supportive of this government, and many of them have done without pressure. You can't really go after them because they were so willing. Right. And as far as the vocal middle class is concerned and upper middle class, for a variety of reasons, because they see their life not impacted, plus I think there is communalism embedded in their, I won't say bloodstream, but certainly they hate the Muslims or the minorities, or they recognize. And WhatsApp, is supreme. Unlike in the West, in America, at least there's some little bit of effort of the big papers to point out what's happening. I don't think it's...
So this is what I mean. The reason that people are not as aware as they should be of what's happening in India is there's a lot of people who support fascism in India. There's a lot of people who go along with it. They're not being forced. It's popular. So people say, well, this is what the people want, the majority wants, forgetting that liberal democracy involves protecting minorities from the tyranny of the majority. And what you have in India is this sort of classic, what's called Herrenvolk democracy, sort of a democracy just for one ethnic group. And that is a kind of fascism.
And it goes along with crony capitalism.
It does. Absolutely, because it's all about, the system is based on loyalty, right? It's all about being part of the tribe, the right group. And so once you have a system based on loyalty and identity, you have to be part of this group, then that's just cronyism. That's going to mean that you're going to distribute jobs on the basis of how close you are to the center of that group, etc. Whereas capitalism in its pure form is always a target of fascism because it says it doesn't matter who you are. So what you have under fascism is a kind of twisted, you have a lot of people making a lot of money, but underlying it is this crony network system based on identity, loyalty. So it's bad for business, as it were.
You've touched upon this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Would you be coming to India to speak? Of course, you can do it on Zoom, though even that you might find being stymied. But would you want
I'd love to come to India. I've never been to India. It is a dream of mine to go to India. It is a remarkable, diverse country. And I've just never been, but I would come in a second. Who wouldn't come to? I think I could. It's of course I would come if I were allowed.
So, on that note, though you never know, I'm not somebody who would say that it would never happen. But the realist part of me would say, well, keep trying. It ain't going to happen.
I'm a philosopher, and India has a remarkable, deep philosophical tradition. So just apart from my political work, and I admire the Indian Constitution.
Yeah. You must have some Indian students.
Oh, many. Yes. And I previously taught at Rutgers, which had many Indian. But yes, of course I have Indian students, Indian American students, Indian students from India.
So on that note, Jason, leaving good wishes to you and a welcome if you came to India. So thank you for taking the chance and talking to The Wire. And I must also point out that lately I don't do mainstream politics. I barely do mainstream politics. But these are the issues, I think, that don't get aired in our media. They do, but not coming from a philosophical, fresh way of looking at things in detail, in depth. So thank you very much for taking time off to speak to us. And with that, we say goodbye, and we will be to Jason Stanley, who spoke about his book. I presume he'll be updating it at some stage, who spoke about fascism based on his last book, How Fascism Works. We'll be back again next week with another guest. Till then, it's goodbye from the Wire Talks team, Siddharth Bhatia, and IVM Podcast partners and colleagues. And we'll be back again next week with another guest. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Ashton meets Dr. John DeMartini. He is a world-renowned human behavior expert and founder of the DeMartini Institute. He shares 5 actionable habits to align our purpose and values. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Disney Plus Hotstar's swelling subscription numbers and actor Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's new alcohol brand, Teremana Tequila. On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk take a close look at the Union government banning another 54 Chinese apps. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explores how Shark Tank India is changing the equation of the startup economy. And on Tere Mere Raste, Keshav takes us to Bhutan's royal capital, Thimphu. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really helps us. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms that you're listening to. And also remember, you can check us out on YouTube at www.ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawalla, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.